Good afternoon. My name is Clara Maria Töpfer, and I am very pleased to present my contribution to the Commons in Space Conference 2022, revisiting the application of the Common Heritage of Mankind principle to outer space. The views I express in this presentation are purely personal and do not necessarily reflect the view of any entity I'm affiliated with. Also, if you have any questions or comments regarding my presentation, please feel very free to contact me. You can find all my contact information on the last slide of my presentation. On November 29, 1968, during the discussions surrounding the conception of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the ambassador of Malta, Arvid Pardo, famously made the following suggestion regarding the resources on the ocean floor of the high seas. It is a new legal principle which we wish to introduce to international law. The common heritage concept implies equitable distribution of benefits from exploitation of the heritage. Only 1 year before, shortly after the adoption of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, Argentinian diplomat Aldo Acoca proposed a very similar concept to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Soon, this newly found principle would be codified in international law, both in sea law, in Part 11 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and in space law, in Article 11 of the Moon Agreement. Nevertheless, its scope and its implementation, especially in space law, remain contested, with the Moon Agreement famously failing to find widespread ratification. Given the imminent possibility of space resource mining, or to say it in the words of the Moon Agreement, as exploitation is about to become feasible, I propose that a critical re-examination of the principle is in order. First, let me shine some light on the content of the principle itself. While both the Law of the Sea and the Moon Agreement refrain from defining the common heritage of mankind principle, academic literature generally agrees on the following 6 aspects of the principle. These can be separated into the first 3 principles: establishing the utilization of the area through an international regime sharing the resulting benefits. Additionally, 3 normative principles are often defined, which lay the requirements for a sustainable utilization to preserve the area for future generations. It's these 2 aspects, the international regime governing the region and the explicit responsibility towards future generations in its use, which extends the principles beyond other ways to share natural resources, such as the global commons or the province of mankind. However, much unclarity about the content and extent of the common heritage of mankind principle remains. On the one hand, it remains unclear whether the principle is limited to a proposal of an international exploitation regime, or if it can be ascribed the extended, normative character of peaceful purposes and environmental preservation as well. On the other hand, its importance and place in international law itself is a contentious question. Academic literature ranges from declaring it a jus cogens norm with erga omnes obligations that has become customary international law, to disregarding it to a mere moral obligation on conceptual idea that lacks enforceability. It's clear that to differentiate between lex lata and lex ferenda when it comes to a principle surrounded by this much ambiguity, an examination of its distinct legislation is necessary. Already during the drafting process of the Moon Agreement, it became obvious that determining in which way the common heritage of mankind should be included was the main point of contention. While many developing countries pushed for the establishment of an international regime to prevent an exploitation of the Moon's resources by the few states technologically capable of doing so, spacefaring nations saw their freedom in space exploration threatened. In the end, its codification in the Moon Agreement is a compromise of both positions. 2 important points have to be raised regarding the text of this provision. First, with the wording of Article 11.1, to determine the rights and obligations arising from the principle toward the state parties, the provisions of the agreement are the only appropriate source of interpretation. Second, close attention must be paid to the wording of Article 11.5. The treaty does not establish a common heritage of mankind regime. Rather, it obliges the parties to consider an establishment of such a regime once the exploitation of the Moon would become feasible, and is upon the state parties to determine when that establishment becomes appropriate. Article 11.7 sets forth a general framework for such a regime. The management of the resources through an international regime and equitable sharing of resources is coupled with the normative elements of the common heritage principle in other provisions of the agreement. The international regime itself is, however, to be determined by the state parties in good faith, in accordance with Article 18 of the Moon Agreement. Therefore, the Moon Agreement comes short of creating an international regime for the exploitation of space resources. Its scope is limited to the commitment to establish a future exploitation regime which is still to be negotiated. Any such negotiation which, it has to be noted, would be limited to the parties of the treaty, may redefine, liberalize, or adapt the proposition of the common heritage of mankind laid out in Article 11.7, or even enforce an even more stringent interpretation of it. Despite these limitations to the common heritage of mankind principle, its inclusion still prevented widespread ratification of the agreement. But, as Carl Crystal stresses, the Moon Agreement obtained the approval of all 47 members of UNCOPUS before it was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Regardless, such an acceptance does not give rise to legal obligations to states not party to the treaty, and with its current 18 ratifications, the Moon Agreement fails to amount legal significance to space exploitation. The same cannot be said for the Outer Space Treaty. With 112 ratifications and 23 signatures, it is widely regarded as customary international law. It does not contain any reference to the common heritage of mankind principle. Instead, it declares outer space a province of mankind in Article 1. The province of mankind places limitations on the freedom of use and exploration of outer space. Many such limitations are defined in the further text of the treaty. While often regarded as a predecessor of the common heritage of mankind, these principles are not congruent. The province of mankind concept is more general, and the Outer Space Treaty comes short of introducing an international resource regime, which is a central aspect of the common heritage of mankind. The other, normative aspects of the principle, however, find expression in the treaty. Articles 6 and 1 establish the use for exclusively peaceful purposes and the freedom of scientific research respectively. The absence of sovereignty is established through the non-appropriation principle contained in Article 2, and while Article 9 contains obligations of due regard and non-interference, the preservation of outer space for future generations can also be ascertained from the province of mankind provision in Article 1. As previously stated, space cannot be considered a common heritage of mankind based on the Outer Space Treaty alone. However, it must be stressed that while the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement do not fully overlap, they certainly do not contradict each other either. It is a bad faith interpretation both of the treaties and the lawmaking process of the UNCOPUS to argue that the Moon Agreement was an attempt to overthrow the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. Just as the Astronaut Rescue and Return Agreement, the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention were aimed at elaborating certain aspects of the Outer Space Treaty, the Moon Agreement can be considered an extension of the principles inherent in it. Given the advances made in technology, the feasibility of resource exploitation is surely to come in the very near future, and the need for legal certainty is becoming pressing. At the same time, since the adoption of the Moon Agreement, no treaty has been adopted by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Giving the pessimistic outlook for the adoption of a new treaty on space utilization, a reconsideration of the Moon Agreement might prove productive. For the Moon Agreement to regain such relevance, and for it to unfold legal weight, widespread ratification must take place. When it comes to rescuing the Moon Agreement, many legal scholars have suggested creating a protocol or an implementation agreement to alter the perceived as radical parts of the common heritage of mankind. In my opinion, however, such a suggestion falls short of recognizing that such a mechanism is already inherent to the Moon Agreement itself, and both the highly contested Article 11 and Article 18 are aimed at exactly such a reconsideration and, if necessary, redefinition of the common heritage of mankind principle. One argument often put forward by states unwilling to ratify the agreement is the lack of clear definition of the principle, but such a definition is yet to take place. The hesitance of the spacefaring nations to ratify the Moon Agreement stems mostly from the perceived limitation of freedom that would come with such a ratification. However, as a close examination of the agreement and its legal context show, much of the hesitance regarding the Moon Agreement arises not from the content of the cautiously formulated treaty, but from the perception of radicality of the common heritage of mankind principle. While iterations of it proposed both in the drafting of space and sea law definitely envisioned far stricter regimes, this does not find its expression in the Moon Treaty. As Arvid Pardo, creator and fierce proponent of the principle, said himself, The manner in which the common heritage principle will be used depends on the necessity of taking into account the wants, needs and interests of developed and developing states. Thank you so much for listening.